Stan Efferding, I gotcha. Almost fitting in the screen. It's
Yes,
great to
indeed.
connect.
Thank you.
We have a lot to talk about: the vertical diet, how to eat sensibly and appropriately for peak performance, recovery, longevity, all that great stuff that you've been deep into. But I'd love to just get an introduction, especially how you plunged into the fitness scene and competing and doing your deep studying. Because I remember that anecdote from talking with Mark Bell, where you left the mansion and the Rolls Royce behind and packed a couple bags and went into the strength training scene because you were a little bored living at the top of the hill or something like that. Let's hear about that, man.
Well, it's a labor of love. It's been my whole life since I was a teenager. I was a scrawny kid, had a soccer scholarship, and I was all of 140 pounds in college. And so I started lifting weights. I wanted to get bigger, and I just fell in love with it. I love lifting. I'm always cautious when I make recommendations to people about their exercise programs, that I'm cognizant of the fact that not everybody loves lifting. So it's been certainly a passion of mine all my life. And, I competed for up until about from 1986 to 1997. And then I took 10 years off of competing while I was building my businesses. And once I was comfortable and, financially, and everything was kind of settled in my life, and I had the time and the resources, I dove back into competition. And I had the opportunity to go down and train with Flex Wheeler down in San Jose back in 2008 and 2009. And so I did. I packed my bags and I jumped on an airplane, and I lived in an extended stay for 3 months while I trained with him every single day, twice a day. And he prepped me to win the Masters Nationals, where I won my IFBB Pro card. And oddly enough, during that time, Mark Bell had reached out to me because I had a history of powerlifting, and he asked me if I would do a meet with him. And so as soon as I got my pro card, I drove from San Jose to Sacramento, and I spent 2 more months training with Mark and set an all-time world record in powerlifting. And I played around a little bit after that with a few more powerlifting meets and a few more bodybuilding shows before my window of opportunity had shut, and I was in my mid 40s, and the weights started getting pretty heavy, and my body started getting pretty tired of all the competition. And so since then, I've just focused on helping others achieve the things that I was able to achieve in my life. I always say, if I knew then what I know now I'm trying to send that message to folks who need help.
So you had sort of two separate forays into intense training and competing, broken up by a decade of going and building businesses that weren't related to fitness, as I understand.
Correct. Yeah. I started a telecommunications company. I had a real estate development company where I bought, built, and sold single family, multifamily, and commercial real estate, and ran an engineering firm, and just a host of different businesses in order to make money. The fitness industry at the time certainly wasn't as lucrative as the potential is now. We didn't have the social media reach, and it was mostly just personal training. And it's really hard to make a good living on personal training. Although now, we've found some methods that can help people make six-figure incomes on personal training. That's one-on-one. And so I worked hard to try and get those businesses up and running so I could have the financial security that I always wanted. And then my passion took over once I was comfortable to get back into competing.
So it sounds like you could relate some success attributes that cross over from lifting the heavy weights and becoming a big guy, and then going and crushing these businesses. It's fascinating that you're able to just apply to whatever your goal was in front of you.
It's interesting that you asked that, because I've said in a number of times, and in one of my Rhino's rants on YouTube, that anybody who's reached a level of success in any sport, with the discipline, the consistency, and the time management that's required, particularly with all the sacrifices, because most of those sports don't compensate you, could be successful in any income producing venture if they applied the same amount of commitment and consistency and time management, and were patient enough. And I've said that probably within 5 years, if you were uniquely focused, I've always said you could be great at anything, but you can't be great at everything. And so you kind of got to pick your path and go hard at it. And things evolve. I understand that, the business plan that you start out with doesn't always end up that way, and actually rarely does. But as long as you're persistent and consistent and then repeat successful behaviors, one of the things you learn in powerlifting and bodybuilding is certain things work, certain things don't. You ask a lot of questions, you learn a lot of lessons, you apply what you can and discard that which doesn't work, and then just keep repeating the same successful behaviors over and over and over again, that you're just obviously likely to emerge at the top.
Yeah, and then you've obviously, back to that analogy to sports, you throw out the stuff that doesn't work because that's how you injured your shoulder. And so if you can keep those metaphors going into whatever's not working in business, and I think a lot of people get stuck there, perhaps, especially when I'm kind of frustrated seeing great athletes struggling in general everyday life. I'm thinking of young kids who were, they were the champs, they were 12-0 on the football team, and then they're drifting around the neighborhood aimless because they've been past their heyday. But you're describing lighting up the same switch, just looking at a spreadsheet rather than a tackling dummy.
Yeah, you hit on a few things there. I find this a lot with ex-military folks. When they're in the military, they have a very specific focus. They have a team of people that they're working with. They have supervision that's telling them what to do, when to do, and they're very successful. And then they get out, and now they really don't have as rigid of a plan. They may have relied on their superiors to help guide them, and they kind of get lost in the day-to-day. I hate being too general, so I want to just offer some specific recommendations that have been very successful for me, both in competing and in business. And it's kind of a daily checklist. And I've talked about that which gets measured gets improved. In the sports industry, we say everything should be measurable and progressible and transferable. And so I just printed out an Excel spreadsheet that had the days of the month across the top, and it had a list down the left-hand side of the things I needed to check off every single day to be successful. And this included my hours of sleep. I'd weigh myself daily, my training, obviously, and there had to be some sort of progression there. I had to get better over time. Any sports supplements that I might be taking at the time. Maybe, nowadays it's my 10-minute walks after each meal. I keep track of those things. It holds me accountable. I can look at that sheet and I can see whether or not I'm accomplishing the I would say obligations or requirements in order to be successful. And I did the same thing in business. Obviously, I would use an Excel spreadsheet to create a financial progress statement, something that I could look out into the future and see, kind of what my long-term financial outlook looked like. But I lived off of a yellow notepad. At one time, I was running $100 million, 1,200 unit property with 5,000 residents and 60 employees, and I ran that thing primarily off of a yellow notepad of paper that I carried with me everywhere. It was on my end table at night when I went to bed. It was on my bathroom counter when I was there in the morning. It was on my kitchen table when I was eating breakfast, and it went with me everywhere throughout the day. And I did one thing, in addition to writing down everything that I needed to accomplish that day. It was just a to-do list. I just found that a lot of that stuff, if I put it in my phone, would end up kind of like, I call it like the junk drawer in the kitchen. Once you close it, you just forget about it. And I wanted those things staring at me, reminding me every single day. And I fell into the often the problem that people often have is I was doing a little bit of everything and a whole lot of nothing. I would, start checking off things on this list that really didn't lend themselves well to the growth of my company. So I had to obviously prioritize those things. And what I would do is I would put little dollar symbols after the things that would actually pay me. And that didn't include a trip to Costco or to Walgreens, the kinds of things that we feel accomplished at the end of the day when we check off of our list. And I started having to economize those things. I had a meal prep company send me meals. I had, companies that there's, what's the name of the Instacart would go do my grocery shopping for me. I started outsourcing the things
Mm.
that would preoccupy my time and my brain power that could better be spent focusing on the things that actually paid me. So the dollar symbols told me that, and I focused on those things and then tried to economize the rest. And so I hope that's helpful, because at the end of the day, I'm kind of a blue collar guy. I'm not a genius. I didn't build these companies and become successful because I was smarter than everybody else. I was just very organized and consistent. I had great time management, and I just knocked things off of my list day after day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And that's how you build a great, bodybuilding or powerlifting or sports career, and that's how you build a great business.
So the to-do list on the yellow legal pad has a $1 sign, $2 signs, $3 signs, or the $5 sign one. You're staring at that, and that's the one you're going to jump on first thing. And sort of that's a prioritization strategy for the various things on your to-do list.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you cross off all the things that you accomplish, and if you find that the things with the dollar symbols on them aren't
All the
getting
other ones are
crossed
crossed off.
and generally
CVS
it's
crossed off.
because usually it's because those things might take a little longer, or
Mm.
they don't really have a start and a finish. Things like marketing, it's a continuous process, and it isn't clean like you check off something that you get at Walgreens. It's something that you have to implement, wait for a response, make a call back, schedule a meeting, close a deal. Those things can take days or weeks to come to fruition, and they just don't become as urgent, or they become easier to postpone till tomorrow. But those are the things that pay you, that afford you the opportunity to do everything else.
So I guess if we're listening now and I'm thinking, gee, Stan, that sounds like a big hassle. I don't really operate that way. There lies our first problem, huh?
I agree, and these foundational items, like when I talk about things just like sleep, I did a rant on YouTube called "Stress for Success." And a few times throughout my career, as much of us have experienced, you end up burning the candle at both ends. You get very little sleep. You're working long hours, 12, 14 plus hours a day, 7 days a week. And you just start deteriorating physically,
Mm.
mentally. Productivity starts to decline. And so at one point, and then stress starts taking over, and anxiety and all of those things. So at one point, when I experienced those problems, I went to the library and I bought a book called Stress for Success by Jim Lohr.
Mm.
And I was reading the book, and I was expecting to find some stress management techniques, meditation or anything like that. And really the foundation of the book was get 8 hours of sleep, exercise regularly, and eat a healthy diet. And I was and coming from a guy who had competed in bodybuilding for over a dozen years prior to that time, it just rang so true to me that I measured everything by performance. I measured it in terms of strength or size. And those things would be adversely affected by things as loss of sleep, missing a meal, missing a workout. And so when you apply that to work, you find the same thing. I immediately, I was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night. I immediately fixed that problem. I started exercising again. I stopped eating crap that I was actually for over a year there getting dollar meals at McDonald's when I started my company, because I was so busy and so
Mm.
broke. It was just convenient. And I realized that all of those things were contributing to my stress and my lack of success. And so, again, those foundational items, while they might sound somewhat boring, that
Mm.
I liken stress to weight on the bar. If you've got a 300-pound bench and there's 200 pounds of weight on the bar, it feels pretty light. But if you've got a 100-pound bench and there's 200 pounds of weight on the bar, it's overwhelming. And I liken stress the same way. And if you're not strong enough from having sufficient sleep, exercise, nutrition, and certainly whatever stress management techniques you use, whether it's deep breathing or relaxation or whatever, then that stress is going to seem heavy to you. But the stress never really changes. You just become weaker or stronger based on what kinds of things you do behind the scenes. And you don't want to avoid stress, and you don't want to reduce stress. Any successful person is just able to handle more stress because they're stronger, more experienced, more organized, and they're able to handle it, because that ultimately, with more employees and more income and more customers, there's going to be more stress. And you just have to be in the position to be able to manage it by having, a good, obviously a good business structure, good employees, good time management skills, so that it just becomes kind of normal to you. You're repping it out, as I would say.
Yeah, I'm envisioning that bar, and then it also happens that certain days there's too much weight on the bar, but the next day the weight's fine. You're kind of going with the flow, just like an athlete with the overall stress score of your life.
Yeah, agreed. And all of it's worth mentioning. And on my to-do list, I also write down my stressors. Dr. Matthew Walker, who's a sleep specialist, PhD, that focuses on sleep, talks about there being substantial research to show the benefit of just something like a worry journal at night before bed, taking out that yellow pad of paper and writing down your stressors. And some of those things could be your to-do list items that you don't want to forget about, and you might sit there and machinate about them over and over again. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. And I write down some stressors, and oftentimes these are things that you're not in control of, but at least if you identify them, you can offload them from your conscious. I'm sure I got you back there. Sorry.
Yeah, good.
Oftentimes, if you write down these stressors and just identifying them and offloading them out of your conscious, where you need to move around a lot of different details in a day, it helps give you room to focus on the other things, because that's sitting there. And sometimes just saying, hey, I'm not in control of that.
Yeah.
I'm stressed about this, but I'm not in control of it. At least you can compartmentalize it and park it somewhere.
That's what I did in April of 2020, Stan, with the pandemic. I just wrote down, like, I have no control over this. I'm going to quit reading about it and live my life, follow the rules, do what I need to do, but quit talking about it nonstop, since I'm not an expert. And it worked really well. I just put it aside. And then, of course, you got to adjust with the things out of your control. But I love that.
Yeah. And I said the same thing about the 24-hour news channels, because I was immersed into this whole political deal with the COVID as well. And I just had to turn off the news channels. I just found that every time I watched them, I was in a bad mood. Pretty simple.
Pretty simple, man. Okay, so speaking of that 140-pound soccer player heading in, that was freshman year of college. You were 140 and a little soccer guy. That's what you're saying?
Yep.
I'm wondering, do you have the most experience of anyone ever with gaining and losing weight?
I feel like I'm very experienced. I will say this: I've gained and lost, albeit intentionally, throughout my career, well over 1,000 pounds. I ultimately, by the mid 90s, 95, 96, I had bulked up to 300 pounds. And I had gone back and forth. I would bulk up to 300 or 280 to compete in powerlifting, to be as big and strong as I could. Then I would diet down to single-digit body fat to compete in bodybuilding. And then I would turn around and flip the switch and do it again, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. And so I had gained and lost a lot of weight, and I learned a lot of lessons along the way. And it's why I'm in addition to training a lot of athletes, I was a high school soccer coach, and I trained the University of Oregon football and track teams all through the early to mid 90s. And just from that experience, having worked with figure, physique, bikini, bodybuilder competitors, and then obviously now hundreds, if not thousands, of dad bods and soccer moms all over the world, I feel like I have experience, but also empathy on both ends of the spectrum for how difficult it can be. And I feel like that I've seen, I've experienced that I made a lot of mistakes, and I learned a lot of lessons, and I experienced that there are ways that you can do it to minimize some of the challenges of extreme dieting or losing a lot of weight and bulking, and potentially compromising your metabolic health from being overfat or those kinds of things. So I talk on both ends of the spectrum, sometimes interchangeably, which can be confusing to folks. But there are some very important, I think, strategies that each individual can use that are somewhat different.
Very confusing. If you want to gain weight, drink orange juice. If you want to lose weight, eat your oranges. Oh my gosh, it gets very detailed. But let's explain a bit for the listener who's maybe not familiar with that competitive environment, the difference between competing in bodybuilding, which I think we're all aware of, the guys oiled up on stage and on the magazine covers with all their muscle showing, and then powerlifting, where, and answer me why as well. Why do you need extra pure body weight to lift a heavier weight?
Yeah, boy, on the dieting spectrum, I call these professional dieters, bodybuilding, figure, physique, bikini, wellness. It goes on and on with the classes, but this is the environment that I cut my teeth on. These professional or extreme dieters, they do a lot of things that aren't very beneficial for the general public, or necessary. And when it was isolated to that industry, I didn't think much of it. I just knew it was, I certainly didn't recommend some of those extreme practices to my clients because I had seen the downsides. But when this industry became so popular over the last, I would say, 7+ years, now with social media, it's everywhere, the diet culture. And your soccer moms are seeing these girls in the quote unquote best shape of their life on stage, and they start following their programs. And what they aren't aware of is behind the scenes, these girls suffer from significant health issues, not the least of which is the female triad, where with chronic calorie restriction comes anemia, which is iron deficiency, amenorrhea, which is a cessation of the menstrual period, and osteopenia, which is bone mineral density loss. And along with the energy loss, the hypothyroidism resulting in hair loss. These are things that we commonly experience in that competitive dieting industry with the bikini and figure and physique girls, that isn't well known to the general public. And for us, it's not surprising when someone goes on an extreme diet and starts to have these issues. We recognize that's kind of more common than not. And so with the dieting, there's a few things that we do. These girls in the dieting industry will be over restricted. They'll just eat egg whites, tilapia, protein powder, broccoli, and maybe a scoop of peanut butter. And that's kind of what I've just described there is most people recognize as your common guru diet, your weight loss diet. And it's absent a lot of the micronutrients that are necessary to maintain good health. Iron being a huge one for women, biotin, which is for skin, hair, and nails. Of course, the chronic calorie restriction results in the hypothyroidism. So they start losing their hair and their energy, and their metabolism starts to slow, and they just can't lose weight even with the over restriction of calories. And so the vertical diet, the program that I use with my customers and clients that I've been using for over 10 years now, it specifies that if you're going to be in a calorie restriction, you want to get the most diverse, highly bioavailable, micronutrient dense foods that you can in order to stave off a lot of these deficiencies. And so I don't exclude red meat. I don't exclude fruit. I don't exclude salt, sodium, which is commonly taken out of these people's diet. And I don't exclude dairy. And for all those reasons, iron, B12, zinc, choline, biotin, calcium, all of those things are commonly deficient in these chronic dieters. And so I'm very careful with my clients, one, not to implement an extreme deficit and to lose weight a little slower, and then just include more foods that provide them the nutrients that they need, and it's more sustainable. That's the big thing. Is that to me, it's not the end doesn't justify the means, and there's no finish line to this. It has to be a lifestyle that's simple, sensible, and sustainable. And so I designed the program based on the individual's ability to comply long term. And is it consistent with their preferential taste, when they eat, what they like to eat, those kinds of things. So that way, because weight loss isn't hard, but weight loss maintenance is very, very difficult. I can ensure long-term dietary adherence. And I kind of apply, just on that same note, a much more modest exercise regimen, because I think a lot of people overtrain and then they end up with what's called compensation, where they get tired and they sit more and eat more. And that's counterproductive, obviously, particularly if you're a busy, a mom, with a job. You can't be tired all day
Hmm.
and hungry all day. And so we avoid those things by doing a more modest amount of physical activity that incorporates some resistance training to maintain lean body mass, and then lots of what we call neat non-exercise activity, just walks, staying on your feet, and that way you burn more calories throughout the course of the whole day than you would if you tried to crush yourself for 40 minutes and then sat around all the rest of the day.
Yeah.
And
It's
then the flip side of that, I'll try and keep this side brief, but the guys who are trying to gain weight, they generally end up overeating and getting too much body fat, and then they start suffering from metabolic syndrome, which is primarily driven by fatty liver, and that'll result in elevated lipids, high blood pressure, high blood sugars. And I've seen that, and I've experienced it myself. I've had over 100 blood tests throughout my career while I was competing, and I could see these things with myself. And so now what I do with my big athletes is I try and mitigate damage by addressing those potential downsides of all that excess body weight.
That sounds like they're eating a lot of the bad stuff, because if they were eating a high amount of nutritious, easy to digest calories, they'd get fitter, stronger, and all that. They'd respond to their training optimally.
It's just too much of a calorie surplus.
Hmm.
And a lot of those calories do tend to be too high in saturated fat, which drives the liver fat, the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the elevation in lipids. And long term, that's a horrible prospect. And then, of course, the insulin resistance and contributes to the high blood pressure. And a lot of these guys experience sleep apnea. And so we've got to get them CPAPs because they're not really inclined to lose a ton of weight. And so that might be a therapy that they have to use in conjunction with all their training. But you're right. They tend to go on these all-you-can-eat diets, these dirty bulks, and they think that a more of a calorie surplus is going to help them gain more muscle. But really, the limiting factor is that muscle is put on the body much slower than fat, and so you have to be a little more patient.
Right, but if you're patient and eat in a calorie surplus, methodically over time, you can avoid those potential drawbacks of getting fatty liver because you're trying to get bigger, and do it correctly and see this steady increase in muscle mass, which is the main goal of the weight gainers, right?
Correct. Coupled with a reduced saturated fat diet, so you can manage your LDL, ApoB, and a sufficient amount of fiber for the same reason. If those two things, those are probably your primary drivers of fatty liver and ultimately all the other metabolic syndrome problems. And so, yeah, I can keep them in a slight surplus. And like you said, eat quote unquote healthier foods is hard. Just, very specifically with respect to LDL, if you could just reduce saturated fats by avoiding bacon, butter, ice cream, hot dogs, things that are saturated fat bombs, and you can increase your fiber intake to probably 10 to 15 grams per 1,000 calories. You can go a long way to mitigate a lot of the problems associated with elevated LDL.
So when you talk about those extreme performers trying to cut up for the contest and have all their muscles showing on stage, we know that's just a one-day snapshot, and it's certainly not healthy to dehydrate and do all the tricks that they do. But I'm wondering if they're following a really sensible diet, they're on the vertical diet program, they're working out really hard, they're not getting depleted, they're not getting hypothyroid. Is it possible to kind of end up at the same destination that you went with your crazy unhealthy practices? In other words, can an elite do this right without compromising their health, and then cut down on the week of the contest, and then get back up to 11% body fat for a female, which is not going to get them in the triad, and then they'll dip down and get back to healthy?
I like what you said there. It is temporary. It is it's for the day of the show. And so can you postpone a lot of these problems, like you said, the triad, et cetera, as long as possible, and then come back as quickly as possible? And the answer is absolutely yes, with a lot of the methods that we just mentioned. I did make another video on YouTube, a Rhino's rant, called "If You Want to Be Healthy, Don't Compete." There is a time, the difference between health and fitness is the ability to perform a particular duty or task. And the fitness level required to be a world's strongest man is likely not healthy. The fitness level required to be a UFC champion or even a 14-year-old gymnast in the Olympics is likely not healthy. You're pushing your body to extremes. But the idea is to, again, mitigate as much of that as you can for as long as you can, and then recover from it as quickly as you can. And all the methods we just discussed, taking your time, using a much slower weight loss protocol, keeping the micronutrients in, not overtraining, getting a sufficient amount of sleep, getting blood tests and watching your hormones to make sure to see how you're affected by this whole process. All of those things can help you participate in this. And then you're able to stay closer to competition weight around the year, so you don't have to crash as hard or take a rebound as badly. I have 120 pound, 115 pound female bikini competitors that are eating 2,400 calories a day, which is kind of where you want to be, is to have created a lifestyle and a workload such as mostly weight training. To be honest with you, a lot of my competitors do very little traditional steady state cardio like the treadmill or the elliptical. As they get closer to a competition, I just prefer that they work out twice a day. They'll go in the morning for 40 minutes and come back at night for 30 minutes and just try and build the kind of body composition, meaning more muscle mass, that burns more calories at rest and certainly burns more calories at work. And then they can eat more food, and then it seems less restrictive. And then the foods that they eat, particularly for dieters, I try to make them more satiating. And that's back to whole foods, a higher protein diet, probably about a gram of protein per pound of goal weight or lean weight, plus sufficient fiber. And then there's other high satiety foods that if you incorporated them into the diet, you'll be less hungry as often. Things like boiled potatoes and oranges, like you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, are very high on the satiety index. You just tend not to be hungry as fast. There are conditions under which your hunger signaling is greater. Lack of sleep is one. Ghrelin hormone starts pumping out like crazy when you don't get sufficient sleep. Another one is PCOS. That's a condition, as you're aware, where women have a lower estrogen and a higher androgen content, and they tend to start storing fat central adiposity around the organs, much the same way that more men do than women, because women without PCOS or prior to menopause tend to store fat in the hips and butt and subcutaneously rather than viscerally around the organs. And although we've suspected that they had a decreased metabolism, basal metabolic rate, now the evidence suggests that that's not the case. They just have an increased hunger signaling and a decreased leptin sensitivity, which is the satiation hormone. So someone with PCOS versus someone without, if they eat a meal, the person with PCOS will be hungry sooner. And they just tend to eat more. And I know it's frustrating. It sounds like I'm blaming the victim, but I'm not. It's just not a matter of willpower. It's the fact that your body is sending signals to make you hungrier more often, and the tendency is to then eat more calories than someone who does not have those problems. And so we try and obviously manage that by first and foremost reducing the liver fat. And there's a number of strategies that we use for that. Weight loss is the big one. A lot of blood sugar issues and insulin resistance occurs as a result of liver fat. Getting sufficient choline in the diet, those are in egg yolks, or you can supplement choline in the diet, helps reverse or prevent fatty liver. And then things like more fiber, of course, lower high glycemic carbs, higher protein. Eating a larger high protein breakfast helps with postprandial glycemia with later meals. And then walking after each meal actually helps. It's twice as effective as metformin for reversing or preventing type 2 diabetes. And that's the number one subscribed medication in the world for type 2 diabetes. And in the absence of all of that, we do now have, I say we, the medical community is been prescribing a medication called semaglutide, which you may have heard of. And semaglutide has been shown to be extraordinarily effective. And what it does is it suppresses appetite.
Hmm.
And so you're just not as hungry as often. And it's been shown that the average sustainable weight loss is somewhere between 5 and 6%, while on semaglutide it's north of 15%. And so it has demonstrated itself with a good safety profile to be very efficacious, particularly for those people who have this increased hunger signal.
Wow, some medicine finally recommended by the actual health experts out there training and doing the right thing. That's amazing. You can fit that piece in.
Yeah, and I mentioned with my blood tests throughout the years, I don't consider myself a holistic guy that's everything's about the root cause. Sometimes people have uh, medical, real medical problems. Hypothyroidism is an example. If you've got Hashimoto's, an autoimmune disease, it's not curable. I know some people claim that it is, but the endocrinologists who deal with this quite regularly suggest that it in the vast majority of cases it's going to need medical intervention. And getting thyroid medication is not is a good idea. It's particularly for those people who are trying to lose weight, not just for your general sense of well-being, because your energy levels will tank, but it will help you burn more calories and stay more active. And the same thing would be true for a male that was hypogonadal and had associated symptoms of ED or fatigue, depression, loss of muscle mass. That would be a great time to go in, get diagnosed, and use all the resources that are available to you. I mentioned postmenopausal women; they should be on estrogen therapy because, again, of the fact that the body will start preferentially shuttling fat to the midsection, to the visceral adiposity, and they'll have bone mineral loss. And particularly for women, that's a huge problem. And so estrogen therapy is definitely recommended for postmenopausal or for even women with PCOS who have low estrogen.
You're saying any postmenopausal women would be a blanket recommendation?
I would in most cases, I would consult an endocrinologist and get diagnosed. And if you have low estrogen, one of the major problems with that, particularly for women, is bone mineral density loss, and that's a huge concern as women age. The most important intervention for that is to get sufficient calcium, potassium, and resistance training. Protein, calcium, and resistance training. Just eating enough protein and calcium isn't enough. You have to provide a stress.
Oh, darn. I got to go to the gym too. Imagine
You've
that.
got to. And I say that, somewhat encouragingly, because I know that not everybody likes to lift weights. And I think that's a shame, because I think the trainers feel as though their clients perceive a hard workout to mean they sweat a lot and breathe real hard, battle ropes and burpees. I don't recommend those for anyone. When someone comes to the gym, I find exercises that they're comfortable doing, and I progressively load them. Things, I might use a trap bar deadlift because it's more comfortable than a regular bar. I might even use like a box squat as opposed to a regular squat, just because it's a little more comfortable to do. I try and find any exercise that the client hopefully enjoys. I try and design the program around the exercises they'll do. And then I get them to progress those over time, which is the single most important factor of the whole thing. We see in research when we're talking about longevity, that strength is a huge contributor to all-cause mortality for lifespan and health span. And more recently, we've all heard about the studies where they use grip strength to measure. It's a proxy. It's overall strength, but that's just how it was measured. They could have used a leg extension or a squat, which prompted everybody to run out and start doing dead hangs. But in fact, the most effective method for building strength is any kind of resistance training. And I would recommend some sort of axial loading. And by that, I mean deadlifting or squatting or weighted carries, because a lot of the bone mineral density that you're concerned about as you age is in your spinal column and your hips. And I want those to be the bones that receive most of the benefit. If you're sitting down doing a leg extension, that's great for the quadriceps, but not necessarily great for bone mineral density. accumulation in the hips and in the spinal column. So I try and find exercises that they enjoy, and then I progressively load them and get them to set PRs. What we found is in the research that it's not the training per se. If you take, say, the top 25%, the strongest group, if you break them up into quartiles, the life extension benefits are the highest for those that are the strongest, not necessarily the ones that exercise the longest. So if guy A is stronger than guy B, but guy B trains twice as long as guy A, guy B still doesn't have the same long-term benefit as guy A, because guy A is stronger. So results matter, and the program should be, again, measurable and progressible over time. It's to me, there's a big difference between exercise and training. Exercise is battle ropes and burpees. Training is measurably progressing load over time so that you are stronger.
And how do you, where do you stack up with someone whose fondness for endurance exercise and measures their progress by how fast they can run the half marathon and hoping that they're promoting longevity as well?
Well, that's VO2 max, and that's important too. They're both important, and it's not a dichotomy. It's not one or the other. The reason I don't recommend a lot of steady state cardio is because I found that long-term compliance is poor, and it's not advisable, or let me say, more exercise is not actually necessarily lead to more weight loss because of the compensatory effect that we talked about earlier. People, when they do more exercise, your body becomes more efficient. As you lose weight, you burn fewer calories for the same time invested in that exercise. Exercise is great for health. It's great for cardiovascular health. And so I do incorporate it into the program, but I can get that out of a brisk 10-minute walk 3 times a day after meals, and also get the glucose benefit, the digestion benefit. We see now that sitting is the new smoking. And if you measure sedentary people against active people, sedentary people who exercise 30 minutes at the end of the day versus more active people who exercise, say, 10 minutes 3 times a day, the more frequent exercisers have the greater benefit. And so I like frequency over volume, if that makes sense.
Right.
And it's more sustainable. Every time you eat a meal, you take a 10-minute walk. It's something that a busy professional can do, taking your kids to class, jumping on a little recumbent bike in your living room or in your garage. 10 minutes is a bite-sized chunk that's sustainable. But the barrier to entry to getting changed, getting in the car, driving to the gym, putting in 30, 40 minutes on a treadmill, and driving home, that's the first thing that goes by the wayside, especially for busy folks. It's just not something people enjoy doing, and it's not terribly effective, and it's not sustainable.
Yeah, there's so many other benefits to getting up from your interaction with the screen for 10 minutes and sprinkling those in throughout the day. And as a former endurance athlete who was doing all that extreme stuff, it's interesting for me to realize that you can get cardiovascular benefits from a brisk walk or even a gentle walk. And you can also get them from going in and doing a heavy strength training session, because your heart rate's up there and you're working hard. It's, the steady state cardio thing has sort of been, in my opinion, overblown, that you need to peg your heart rate at this level and last for 30 minutes or 45 or 60 minutes, where you're getting cardiovascular benefits from all kinds of exercise.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to crap on anybody's preferred exercise. The best exercise is the one you'll do. I start there.
Yeah.
And if
what's the best diet, Stan?
The one you'll follow.
Oh, imagine that. Wow.
So, and that's why we spent so much time talking about today about compliance, about building habits, about sustainability, about simple, sensible, and sustainable. My quote is, compliance is the science. I've lived by that, and I definitely focus all of my programs on finding ways, and we talked about satiety, ways in which you can almost subconsciously, through habit and through preventing yourself from getting too hungry too often. You have to utilize all these strategies, because your body's going to fight you every step of the way. Everybody wants to find a particular demon or an enemy, and identify an enemy. It's carbs, or it's fats, or it's this, or it's that, and I've even had my own, things over the years that I said were particularly egregious. But what we know is that the obesity epidemic is a result of excess caloric consumption, period. And the foods we tend to overconsume are the ultra processed foods. And in study after study, when they feed whole foods against ultra processed foods, the ultra processed foods folks just tend to eat about 500 to 700 calories more a day because they're not as satiated. And so, that's a good advice to go to whole foods, but you got to be cautious about demonizing any particular food. And it's okay. Alan Argan talks about the flexible diet where you have kind of an 80-20. When people are dieting at a significant calorie deficit, it becomes harder and harder to do an 80-20 because you have to get sufficient protein, calcium, iron, all in your diet before you have room for your typical splurges. And that's why I like to build metabolism so that you can eat more calories. So you have an opportunity to have a little more of the things that you enjoy, but they have to be controlled. They have to be calorie controlled. There's just no all you can eat diet. And some people find that they're more satiated by doing time restricted feeding, by skipping a meal. Some people find they're more satiated by skipping carbs, by going keto. And that's fine. That's very individualistic. There's no research to suggest any's better than the other. It's what seems the least restrictive to you is what's important. And that should be good news. I know people are like, well, damn it, Stan, now what do I eat? I don't, what's the best diet? And I prefer to put all that information out there because then you get to choose and you don't feel as though you're funneled into a particular diet dogma because it's supposedly the only thing that works or because it worked for someone else. It doesn't work any better than any other diet for you. You get to choose which form of restriction to use, but they all end up, if they work, restricting calories to the point where you're in a deficit so you can lose weight. We just want to find the one where you're not so hungry that you can't sustain the diet.
And again, I'm guessing you're going to tell us to be patient with that weight loss.
Yeah.
So that,
although I'll say this, if there's significant, if someone has a significant weight to lose, if they have obesity, if they have type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, one of the most effective interventions for the quickest resolution of type 2 diabetes is an 800 calorie liquid diet. Within 7 to 10 days, they see a massive reduction in HA1C. Now, I'm not saying that's sustainable, but in a triage situation, there may be times in that first 2 to 4 weeks where people can utilize what I would typically suggest is an over-restricted diet or an excessive calorie restriction, particularly if you're lifting weights during that time and getting some protein. Weightlifting will help you greatly in retaining lean body mass, even with minimal calories, not long-term, but short-term. Stu Phillips' lab out of Canada, at McMaster University, did a study where they had, I think they had 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram, and they did another one that was half of that. And they both worked out, and they both retained their lean mass in the short term because they were training hard. The lower calorie, lower protein diet people, they were pretty exhausted after the 30 days. But if that's enough to get that first, the number is generally around 6 or 7% body fat loss that helps to mitigate about 95% of fatty liver as measured with biopsy. And now if you're a 300-pound person, that's 20 pounds. And it's very reasonable to think that you can lose that in the first 30 days with an all-out program because you have it to lose. I'm talking about people with a significant amount of excess weight that's resulted in those blood markers, type 2 diabetes in particular, and fatty liver. And a 15% weight loss can reverse type 2 diabetes and restore pancreatic function for those who haven't had type 2 diabetes for too long of a time, many years. And pancreatic function, of course, is what drives your insulin release so that you're not insulin dependent as a type 2. Some type 2s are on insulin. And that is reversible with a 15% weight loss. Now you're looking at 45 pounds for a 300-pound person. And that's a significant weight loss. That, when we look at the research, I know we hear about these people who lost 100 pounds. That's not too terribly common. They were patient and persistent and consistent, and they were able to do it. Generally speaking, about a 5% weight loss on average is what people can sustain. And so if you're doing better than that, you're doing great. I give yourself props. And 5%, 6% is enough to impart significant health benefits. So don't think that just because you don't have a six-pack that you're not healthier because you lost 5%, which again, for a 300-pound person's, not going to be that much. That's only 15 pounds.
For 150 or 200-pound person, still very visible and must feel great to drop 10 pounds. I mean, it's a big difference.
100%. And you'll see, I said this recently on Tom Bilyeu's podcast. I talked about the McDonald's diet. I spoke about this in my obesity rant some 5 years ago, that 95% of health benefits are realized simply from weight loss itself, irrespective of the diet. Now, it got cut off right there.
Yeah. Soundbite.
My very next line was, I would never recommend a McDonald's diet for all the reasons we discussed. For satiety in particular, it's not terribly sustainable long term. And you might end up with micronutrient deficiencies, and potentially because if it's burgers and the burgers are 75-25 beef, they're high in saturated fat and your LDLs may suffer. But initially, even with a keto diet that's super high in fat, the weight loss will allow for a reduction in LDL. So you do see improved blood markers initially, irrespective of diet. And so, again, back to the 800-calorie liquid diet, if weight loss is that important and you can realize such significant health benefits, at least initially, then, that's what I'm focused on. And then long term, hopefully we can educate the habits necessary to do something that's more sustainable.
And that's where the vertical diet comes in. You've bounced around with some good philosophical insights that shape what you call the vertical diet. So before you go, maybe you could give us this formal send off of what that diet's all about. Why did you name it the vertical diet? And then, how we can learn more and connect with you and get those great, that great coursework that you keep updating that contains all your research and all your rationale.
Yeah, I took everything that I wanted my clients to do from 30 years of competing and coaching and college and collaborating and being coached. And I put it into one document I called the Vertical Diet ebook, which is now in its third evolution, Vertical Diet 3.0. I've upgraded it periodically over the years with new information. And I partnered with a PhD RDN that was director of dietetics for UNLV. And now we've got over 500 peer-reviewed published research articles, videos, and attached to the diet. But it's really everything. It's not just diet, it's sleep and hydration and nutrition and it's digestion and it's blood pressure and cholesterol and blood testing, and all those things are in there. And I give this to my clients, so I don't have to repeat myself over and over and over again for everyone that I talk to, and say, here are the things. And I put them in a pretty simple to follow, again, as described, checklist with a hierarchy of most important to least important, so that people can start implementing these things. And it focuses a lot on, simple, sensible, sustainable, and compliance is the science. The name itself, I just felt that, how tall is a pyramid? It is dependent upon its base, the size of its base. So I want to build a strong foundation. I talked about getting highly bioavailable, micronutrient dense, easy to digest whole foods. And so it starts with the foundation, which is, if we're going to look at macros now, obviously we've already described the fact that calories are king. And if you want to lose weight, you got to be in a deficit. So how do we get there? And so I start with a higher protein than what might historically have been considered normal. About 30 to 35% of total calories, or 1 gram per pound of goal weight. Protein's part of the foundation. And then a variety of protein sources, as mentioned. And I don't demonize red meat, and I don't demonize eggs. I've got all the research in there to talk about cholesterol and saturated fat and at what point those things become concerning and for whom, based on blood testing and your genetic predisposition. I keep dairy in, of course. The calcium is very important for bones, also for nerve signaling and for muscle contraction and relaxation. So I have a broad spectrum of protein sources. And if you're allergic to dairy, you can avoid it. But if you're intolerant, then you can utilize lower lactose sources like a fat-free Greek yogurt or cheese, cheddar cheese, and then dose dependent after that. So I've got eggs in there, I've got dairy in there, I've got some steak in there, salmon twice a week for omega-3s. So a broad spectrum of protein sources prioritized into the diet at 35% of your total calories. And then next, my macro would be fats at around 30%. And that's because, fats are important for every cell membrane in the body, A, D, E, and K. And fats beyond that, which provide you a health benefit, don't necessarily provide you a performance benefit. And that's where I started on the carbohydrates. And that would be the rest of those calories. So you could look at a third, or, a 35 or a 30, 30, 40, carbs being the 40. And those carbs start with, again, a foundation of fibrous carbs that are potassium rich. Potato has twice the potassium as a banana. You want to get about 4,700 milligrams of potassium a day. Dieters generally end up staying right about there. They end up with a potato, a couple pieces of fruits, and vegetables, and that's probably will satisfy their carb demands in order to diet. And my bulkers, my weight gainers, are going to need more carbs, and they might have to throw in some oatmeal or even some white rice to drive a huge workload or a large body, so it's easier to digest. So that's the foundation for the vertical diet and its nutrition components, kind of in a nutshell. And then, whether or not they want to gain weight or lose weight, I just adjust total calories.
Well, it's way too sensible. I don't see any gimmicks there. It's never going to sell. I'm sorry. You got to give me some. It's too sustainable. We're not going to need to jump to the next thing. It's amazing that you've been doing this for 10 years, and I'm going to direct listeners to read more about this and learn more about it and sign up, because I feel like the masses in general and the diet scene in general is been marching toward this sensibility. And it's taken 10 years to land on the stuff that you've been doing and getting, the balance of macronutrients and going for the best micronutrient sources and not fooling around with anything that's unsustainable. But I love that point you make, where if you're going to lose weight, you can do it with the Twinkies or the McDonald's or whatever, and all that ridiculousness we put in proper perspective, and then get to this point where we're happy with our body, and then do something that really works and doesn't, throw you off track with hypothyroid and all the dead ends that people run into, and they come to you with their tail between their legs.
Yeah, I don't want people to be tired and hungry. That's just not sustainable.
Besides that, yeah, your diet's fine. How's it now? Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And everything's at stanefferding.com. I have a nationwide meal prep company where I send meals to people's doors all over the country at stanefferding.com. My Instagram is at @stanefferding, and I have that YouTube site I mentioned is just under Stan Efferding. And I put there's a lot of free content on there and videos and stuff that I think covers a lot of the stuff that we discussed today. They're kind of fun. I purposely planned them out so they'd be enjoyable and brief and information packed.
Yeah, incredible resource. And we really, I want to say thank you, because you've been putting it out there for so long, and just very generous with the stuff that you give away. And of course, that's going to lead people to take further action. But it's a rare privilege to talk to you, and I'm sure there's much more. Maybe I'll have you back sometime, but I want to end by asking, you're still going strong. You're not competing, but what about your regimen today? You've hit the big 5-0 like me. And what does it look like now?
Yeah, I turned 55 next month, and I've been bragging about the fact that I'm so healthy, meaning I don't have the chronic knee and joint pain that I had when I was powerlifting. I've since rehabbed from all of that, and I have a much more sensible training program. I utilize lower fatigue movements, and I'm cautious with my joints, but I still lift reasonably heavy, and that's all a matter of it's nothing like I used to do. Well, more recently, about 2 months ago, CT Fletcher called me, and he said he wanted me to come down in January and deadlift as a guest at his Iron Wars that he holds at Iron Addicts in LA. And he's a legend. You don't say no to CT. And at the time, my max deadlift, about less than 3 months ago, was probably a 600, which is, for me, not great. I've deadlifted well over 800 in competition. And I was like, sure. And then I realized when I hung up the phone that I didn't want to go down there and embarrass myself. So I've been training a little heavier recently, admittedly, and it's been a little harder to recover from, but I employ some very important things that I recommend to all my athletes, and certainly my clients that are older who used to crush themselves with lots of heavy weight. And I use low fatigue movements. So I use the box squat, or I use some good mornings off of pins. So it's mostly concentric movements. And it just creates less fatigue, less eccentric loading. So I have less muscle damage. And I have been able to, over the last 3 months, get my deadlift back up to just over 700. So I'm pleased with that. I'm not trying to do anything more that I might injure myself. But this is when I have to say, do as I say, not as I do. I wouldn't encourage everybody in their 50s to deadlift 700, but I'm careful about how I'm going about it. And but again, there's, if you want to be healthy, don't compete. There's always a point at which you can do too much.
And low fatigue training when you're over 55. Love it, man. What a great suggestion. Stan Efferding, everybody, the one and only.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you so much. Da, 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 da.